A MIDI map can also be used to control external hardware, connected to your computer using a MIDI interface. Here, I'm using the remote SL as my USB MIDI interface, and I've connected the MIDI out of the SL to the MIDI in of the hardware synth, and vice versa. Now, I can create a MIDI control map by activating a MIDI channel, like channel 3. Then, if I was just wanting to control the hardware synth and no plugins, I would set the MIDI input and output ports of the Automap Universal software to the ports on the connected MIDI interface. In this case, SL USB port 1, which is then being routed to the MIDI output on the back of the SL. Then all this MIDI data here is sent directly to the hardware synth when I move Nocturn's controls. However, it's much more likely that you'll be wanting to control your plugins using Automap, as well as controlling the hardware synth at the same time. So to do this, you need to set up a MIDI track in your sequencer for the hardware synth. The MIDI input and output settings for the track should be all inputs for the input, and the output of your MIDI interface for the output, in this case SL port 1. Then if you're also using Nocturn's MIDI client to control the Ableton mixer or some other device, you need to set the MIDI channel on the input to the channel of the control map you've just created, in this case channel 3. Then make sure that the MIDI output channel is also the same as that of the control map, so channel 3. You then need to make sure the synth is set to receive and send MIDI data on that channel, probably by going into the main menu of the synth and selecting the global MIDI channel. Lastly, hit record on the MIDI track. Now, the Automap Universal MIDI settings should be all for the input, so you can receive MIDI feedback from the synth, and Automap MIDI for the output. With these settings, you should see the MIDI data coming into Ableton, and that data will route out to the synth, like so. The best thing about this setup is you can use the Learn button to map parameters. So, to map my envelope to the encoders over here, I activate Learn Latch by pressing the Learn button twice, then assign by moving the control on the synth, and then touching the encoder I want to assign it to. Then I just turn off Learn mode, and we're done. I hope you found the tutorials informative and useful. For any further support, consult the answer base at novationmusic.com.